This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 361, the Drupal Credit System. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about the Drupal Credit System with Dr. Matthew Tift. Dr. Matthew Tift is a lead engineer at Lullabot. Yep, that's right. We have two bots on the show today, folks. He has been involved in the Drupal project since 2010, helping to organize multiple Drupal core initiatives and writing and presenting extensively about the Drupal community. Matthew is also a yoga teacher and musician. He leads meditation groups and co-organizes the mental health working group at Lullabot. He teaches yoga and meditation at his local community. In his local community, he hosts two podcasts, not one but two. A meditation podcast called Pretty Good Meditation and Hacking Culture, a show exploring practices and technologies that contribute to well-being. Matthew has a doctorate in musicology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Matthew joined us previously on Talking Drupal 115. And Matthew, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's great to be here.
And, next time we have you on, we're going to have to make sure it's not like 200 plus episodes in between. I, for those that don't know, am John Picozzi. And today my co-hosts are Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development. Nick, how are you?
I'm doing great.
Also joining us for the second time, Kathy Thays, support manager at Lullabot.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be here again.
Let's move on to our module of the week. Nick Laughlin, tell us about Entity Redirect.
Yeah, so Entity Redirect is a module that does exactly what it sounds like. It's, maybe a little bit different. It's not Rabbit Hole. So Rabbit Hole is the module that lets you prevent people from getting to a particular entity. Entity Redirect allows you to set up certain rules for different actions of an entity, meaning when you create an entity, redirect here. When you edit an entity, redirect here. When you delete it, redirect here. And I found it because it solved a problem that I occasionally run into with certain things. Sometimes you have an entity that manages a process. So I have an entity that when it gets saved, something needs to happen, and I have like a Boolean on there to say, hey, this item has been processed, it's been done, but it's an automatic process. And that checkbox is kind of just a fail-safe to make sure that it doesn't just continually get processed every time the process runs. It's like, this has been processed, we don't need to look at it again. The problem is that the update hook and the create entity hook doesn't have a very clean way of defining, hey, I've done this, let me modify it. For example, when you interact with the create hook of an entity, many times it's difficult to edit that particular entity and change something on it. Like usually you just have access to the information that's coming in. You can't trigger an entity save because all sorts of weird stuff happens if you try to trigger an entity save in a create hook. So this module actually solves that problem in a somewhat roundabout way. You can tell it to redirect to a particular route when the entity is saved, and then you can use that route to trigger the process for that entity, and then you can do whatever you need to. Because at that point, the entity has now been created, and you can just interact with it the way that you want to. I'm also using it on that particular project for a bunch of other stuff, just to like when somebody edits something, it redirects them to a different place to show them what they've edited. In a nicer way, but it's a very simple module. It gives you access to some tokens, not everything that you might want, but it seems like a fairly straightforward module. I've been using it for about a week, and like I said, it solved the problem that I ran into, and was really easy to install.
Interesting. So different from you had mentioned Rabbit Hole, but different from the regular redirect module, which is just like a basic like URL redirection, right? This is specifically for entities, right?
Yeah. So you can say, I mean, it can be nodes or whatever, but you can say like when somebody creates a node of this type, send them to the profile page, or wherever you want to send them. And you have those same levels of redirects for most of the CRUD operations. I don't know if you can redirect people when they try to view it. I think you can. So you could use it for rabbit hole purposes as well, if that's the case. But like I said, I'm using it just for when somebody creates it, send them to a different route that triggers a process. And
is it something you can set on entity by entity, like not entity by entity, but like specific entity, like and per entity, or is it something like you have to create it kind of globally? Like, for example, if we'll use nodes because those are the easiest, right? If I had like node 12 and I wanted it to do something, could I set it at that level?
It's not specific entities; it's per bundle. But you can give users control over their own rules with permissions.
Right.
So if you want a user to say, "Hey, I want to be redirected here instead of there when I edit my profile," they can configure that themselves.
Interesting.
Yep.
All right. Let's move on to our primary topic, unless somebody wants to talk more about entity redirect. No, I think we're good. Matthew, start us off by telling us about the Drupal credit system.
Sure. And I will begin by saying that there are simple ways to describe this, and then there are very, very, very complex ways to describe this. And so I'll just start off by saying that the Drupal credit system, or contribution credit system, is a way to give people credit for their work or their participation in the Drupal community. So that's one way to view this. And you might say that this is, or one way I like to think about this, is that it is a way of sort of extending some of the basic information that we have, because a lot of folks know who's contributing to a project because they would say, well, that's all in the Git logs. So in a sense, what the Drupal credit system is doing is expanding what the Git logs offer to be able to give people the opportunity to give credit, not just to a developer, but maybe to the employer of that developer, or maybe even the client that that developer is working with. And then going beyond that, to give credit to people that aren't doing any sort of coding work at all, and to give them credit for their work in the community, such as attending a meeting or hosting a podcast about Drupal. Those are all the kinds of things that you could use, and those are just a few of the kinds of things that you could use the Drupal credit system for. But that's about as short as I could keep it, to just kick us off to say that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of gamifies giving people credit for things, but I think in the best possible way. Like you mentioned, it also covers like non-code contributions. But I think that really is one of the most powerful things to come out of this change. And I completely didn't expect it. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you looked at somebody's their Drupal.org profile, you'd see like they helped close this issue or worked on this issue, right? But once there was a credit system in place, people started really thinking about, like you said, people meeting to talk about a camp, or people on a podcast. Like now we have a concrete way to give credit, and it makes you think about that contribution intentionally. And when you have something that you can now measure, that gives people more incentive to, well, it does a few things. One, it gives people more incentive to do the thing that's being measured, but it also gives people insight into what people are actually doing, right? If you don't have the data, you can't analyze it. And until we had something like this, it was very hard to see like who's participating. If you're not in those meetings, it's very hard to see who's taking part. But yeah, I think it's, like I said, I think it's a way to gamify credit and recognition in the best sense of the word.
It's funny. I was going to use the term gamify or gamification, and I kind of was like, I don't know if I want to liken it to that. But yeah, I guess you're right. in that synopsis.
So now that we know what the Drupal credit system is, how does somebody get credit in kind of the Drupal sphere?
Well, if I may, I'd like to just talk a little bit about that gamification issue.
Sure.
I wrote a whole article about this called "How We Compare" that talked about leaderboards and other comparison metrics in the Drupal community. I wrote that back in September of 2021, and I looked into that very issue of gamification. I have also been involved in another community called the Chaos Community, which is the Community Health Analytics Open Source Software community. And that I started hearing about people using a phrase leaderboards. And leaderboards are something where there's actually quite a bit of academic research about this. And that's the sort of gamification of this, where you would say, here are the top contributors. So I kind of thought about this in a broader scope. Now, you mentioned at the onset that I have an academic background, so I kind of dug in, and I'm a historian sort of by training. And I thought about the history of this in the Drupal community. So if I may, you might remember something called Certified to Rock, which is a website we used to use. And
Way back.
even companies like Lullabot used to mention it. You could use your certified rock score when you were applying for a job, and it had real world implications. But basically, it was this sort of secret algorithm to determine how much somebody was contributing to the Drupal community. And that didn't last. And because people didn't, what's the secret thing? Who gets to determine who contributes? And so anyways, so that's one aspect. We've also had Drupal cores in the past. People may recall that, which was another sort of leaderboard that you could go visit. It
was a legitimate leaderboard. It was people ranked by like their number of contributions. That like in leaderboard in my head, that is like the same.
Right. So this was like, for a long time during Drupal 8 development, it was like, does Alex Pott have the most contributions, or is it Tim, or is it I can't remember who the other person was, but there were all these people that were like, but these were just developers because it's just code contributions. But anyways, so we've had a lot of opportunities to do things like this in the Drupal community. I could talk about it at length. You could go look at that article, read about some of these different things. But one thing I do want to make clear is that having a system like this invites gamification. It encourages people to gamify things. It changes how people behave.
Yeah.
So I'll say that again.
So,
okay,
go ahead.
go ahead. I was just going to say, I'm repeating what I just said, but I was just going to say it changes how people behave. And just like any leaderboard in any community, it can be beneficial in that people are motivated to work because they want to be on that. Whereas other people feel like I'll never have the opportunity to be at the top. So therefore my contributions don't matter. So there's all kinds of implications for having a system like that.
It definitely incentivizes behavior, and you have to be very careful to make sure you're incentivizing the right behavior. I mean, the most famous example of that is the Cobra example in India, where there were a lot of cobras in India causing some problems, and I think the British government said we'll solve that by paying a bounty, and so then people started farming cobras to get the bounty, and then the British government realized that they were paying farmers to raise cobras to kill them, and they weren't like catching wild ones. So I said, okay, we're going to end the bounty system. So then all the farmers were like, well, these cobras are now useless. And so they just released them all into the wild. And so the end result was they ended up with far, far, far more cobras causing problems over the next few years. And so whenever you're dealing with some sort of incentivized system, you need, like you said, you need to be very careful that you're incentivizing healthy behavior for the community long term.
It's funny, what I got from that was that gamification isn't necessarily a bad word. but it's if it's fostered and structured correctly, it can be beneficial. And I think,
Yeah.
part of that is like we've all seen it, right? Every year Dries kind of puts out a list of the top contributors, top companies, top stats for Drupal, right? And that's really powerful, not only to the community, but also to people looking to evaluate Drupal, right? You see a robust community, you see people involved. You also, and Matthew mentioned this, right? It's a metric for employment in some places, right? You're looking at, if you're applying for a new job, when I was interviewing people, that would be one of the things that I would factor in is like, how involved are you on Drupal.org? What kind of projects are you working on? And the folks that didn't show any contribution or couldn't kind of talk to their contribution, may not have done as well as others who were like, oh, I do all of this stuff and whatnot. So yeah, I think a lot of times gamification can be thought as a bad word. And until Matthew explained it the way that he did, I was kind of in that camp.
I also think, and this is purely anecdotal, but I'm sure there's some level of gamification going on with the credit system. People are trying to inflate their numbers and get on that leaderboard per se. But I haven't seen a horrible amount of that in the Drupal community, or a significant amount of that in the Drupal community. And the one piece of evidence I can point to is that Steve, John, and I ended up on that leaderboard one year. And it was the year that we realized that we could make a non-code project for Talking Drupal and give hosts and guests credit for being on each show. And we made the decision to kind of backlog those as well. So anybody who had been on the show in the past, we went through all 250 episodes at that time and gave each person that was on the episode credit. And because of that, we basically compressed, 7 or 8 years of contribution into, a couple of weeks when we added all those tickets. But because of that big bulk of tickets, the three of us actually ended up on that top 20 contributors list.
I mean, we were towards the bottom, but still.
Yeah. Which, like I said, isn't fully accurate because, like I said, it was 8 years of contribution compressed into a couple of weeks. So it artificially inflated, what we were doing. But the thing is, I think if people really were putting their mind to inflating their numbers and getting on that list, like it wouldn't have taken just us creating 200 issues to get in the top for the year, right?
Also the community's holding people accountable, right? When the community sees that, like people are sensitive to it, or at least reacting to it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's not unusual, is to see somebody pop up on the leaderboard and then, or whatever we're gonna call it, and then be like, hold on, does that make sense? Right? Like, is this an initiative that's happening right now that's getting a lot of activity, or is this somebody who's modifying their behavior because we've told people these are the metrics that are important to the community and they're trying to repeat that behavior? And it is regular that an experienced contributor would reach out to a new contributor and say, thank you so much for all of your activity. These metrics are intended to have this effect. We see that you really want to help. And then redirect that person to some activity that is the best of multiple worlds. A thing they can see reflected in their contributions, and also something that is really relevant to the community at that particular moment, because there's like so much to do.
I also think that the only, and I haven't seen a lot of this, but I think the only kind of two negative things that I've seen is, or the negative things that I can see really happening is, one is somebody aggressively asking for credit or aggressively asking for credit maybe where credit isn't due, like just being like, hey, I commented on this, give me credit, right? and that can become, if you're a regular contributor and you're just working through, if you miss somebody and just constantly getting that, I can see how that could wear down on your incentive to contribute. The other thing is, like, another thing, like you mentioned, Matthew, with people getting disincentivized because they feel like they can't get there. If they do contribute and they're expecting credit and they don't get credit, that can also be demoralizing. Like, I know there's been some tickets. The most common is, like, there's some ticket, you create a patch, you roll or re-roll a patch, you contribute in some way, and then the maintainer of the module goes, oh, that's a great fix, but it had a conflict, so I created a different patch over here in a different issue, and I merged that one in, and then they close that issue as not going to be fixed, and you don't get a contribution credit. And I think that can be demoralizing too. I think the important thing, though, is that the contribution credit system, those issues existed before the contribution credit system. They're not introduced by the contribution credit system, but they give us a way to kind of measure it and call it out.
I can say that there have been, so again, I've written a lot about this. I've studied these data quite a bit, and I've heard a lot of personal stories from people that have been negatively affected by the credit system. Because, well, let me just say a few more details about it. One of the things that you can use it for is to differentiate between when you've volunteered versus when you're working for an organization. You can say, so for example, I work at Lullabot. One time I was working for a client named Georgia Public Broadcasting. I was working on some modules for them related to National Public Radio, like the NPR module. So I could say something like, I was doing this work on behalf of Lullabot for my employer, Georgia Public Broadcasting, on this module. And I also was doing this in the evenings as a volunteer, because I've worked in public radio, or I worked in public radio for 8 years, and I wanted to help contribute to this on my own time. So all of these things could be true. So we can tell complex stories like that. And Dries and I Dries Boytart, the founder and project lead of Drupal, maybe I don't need to say that in this podcast, but we looked at the data going back to when the credit system first. Well, he first proposed this in 2015. In 2016, Dries and I co-wrote an article called "Who Sponsors Drupal Development," where we tried to steer the conversation, where we tried to look at what we thought was interesting about all of these data. And Dries, for example, was very interested to see, like, what sorts of companies are contributing to Drupal, and he wanted to acknowledge those. We wanted to find out how many people in the community are volunteers versus how many people are getting sponsored. And he's been updating that article every year ever since. And again, there's lots of stuff in there. We make lots of different points about how this works, about who we should give credit to, and show different leaderboards and different ways to slice and dice the numbers. But I do feel like what Kathy was mentioning before is ultimately what we're really trying to encourage is some of the personal interaction to make people feel like they're part of the community, to properly acknowledge people that are contributing in ways that aren't just giving code, and all of these other kinds of things. So we could really see, like, for example, it was clear that a big majority of the work in Drupal was being sponsored, and we didn't know that before we had this system. So
yeah, that was a big enlightenment.
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways to slice the data. There's a lot of stories you can tell. I wrote another article years back called "The Cultural Construction of Drupal," and all of these different narratives that we tell about Drupal, such as Drupal is for big business, or Drupal is really mostly just coming from one company, or all of these other kinds of ways that we can talk about it. And I do think that our contribution credit system helps us talk about it in ways that make it a little bit more than opinions and more than guesses, more than here's what I saw on the issue queue. So there's a lot of interesting ways that we can use these data, but I just wanted to point out a few of those sources in case folks want to dig deeper into that.
I'm wondering how the data is tracked. I know there's been some conversations about like trying to port some of these features to GitLab, and like, because Drupal does some amazing, unique things in terms of what it tracks. But I'm wondering about the how, if you know anything about that. Otherwise, it's okay if you don't.
I know a lot about that, and I spent quite a few hours last year working on that particular issue with the GitLab, because Drupal is moving towards GitLab, and the contribution system is one of the key things that the Drupal community needs, and GitLab doesn't have it. So Tim Lanen, who's with the Drupal Association, he and I last year spent a lot of time talking at conferences outside of the Drupal Association, such as GitLab Commit and at All Things Open, and going on different podcasts and talking about how it works, doing our best to try and tell people, here's what it does. And one of the things that really was interesting to me is everybody who hears about this, all the people at the chaos community, when I talk about this, they say, wow, that is so cool. I wish we had something like that. So there is an issue open on GitLab that has been open for a long, long time. And there's a lot of discussion in that. And we're trying to port this over. And so we are trying to get this into GitLab, as well as any other system, that other Git system, GitHub, or whoever else would like to try and implement our way of giving credit. So we've been talking about it in terms of like, here's what it does, rather than a lot of the technical aspects of it, and then having conversations about the implications of that. So yes, there's a lot of effort to do this. There is an issue. You can go in there and make comments. The GitLab community itself is very open, so you can see all of these discussions about what they're having. It's really interesting internally with people in that issue saying like, "Oh, that's not my department," or this is my role, or we should devote money to this or not. But if you want to see it in GitLab, we can put a link to that issue, and you can go in there and say, "We need this."
Do you know what the trickiest part of integrating this with the Drupal system was, or what the trickiest part of moving it to GitLab will be?
Well, there's a lot of tricky things. There's the back end type of the back end, like technical implementation of it. There's the other things like the user experience in terms of like replicating our little volunteer checkboxes, replicating our organizations and how you can link to organizations, figuring out how to display the results of those data, figuring out, again, are there going to be leaderboards, that are associated with this? So there's a bunch of interesting questions that come out of this, because it's sort of expanding what most projects think about in terms of how they count contributions.
And is it simply just like lifting and shifting, like the idea of like where those credits are stored and how the system works? Or is it more generalizing it so GitLab can use it more widely for everybody as opposed to just for the Drupal community?
Yeah, the goal is to be able to let people use it much more widely and not just have it be a Drupal thing. Okay. And it seems that there's been interest among lots of folks that think that this would be beneficial. And for comparison, I've looked at a bunch of other systems like the Apache Project Maturity model, or the different metrics we have in the Community Health Analytics open source software, or there's something else called Basics, which is building analytical and support infrastructure, where all of these different places that are trying to measure different things. And they have different goals. So for example, some people that want to measure, they are interested in like are there any banks that sponsor this? But
Right.
that, that comes out of like a financial model of looking at how we want to contribute. They want to make sure that people aren't doing things on their own time. Like they want to monitor the health of a community, and having volunteer credits actually indicates that there's a problem, because that means that there's this privileged group of people that can contribute to this project outside of work, and that's not fair. So it brings up all kinds of interesting issues when we say, hey, let's make this broadly available to folks. So
Mm-hmm.
we say we would like this available on GitLab, GitHub, GNU Savannah, these other platforms. However, not everybody wants that, and not everybody they don't want to always know some of these pieces of data, I think.
I think it's interesting too that a lot of the interesting thing to think about too is a lot of open source projects are only contributed on by one person or two people. I would bet the vast majority of actual open source projects have a single contributor, right? The person who created it. So, but I think that this could, if it's done right, could incentivize more people to contribute to more projects, especially if there's some sort of global contribution system you can see where people can see, like, Drupal has it internally. Other projects have ways to give credit to people internally, but if you can see like this person has contributed to 20 different projects, then there's incentive there to go wide as well, right? And maybe give some help to some projects where that need it. So I definitely think that's interesting.
Yeah. That's kind of why I asked the question. I was interested in, like, we were talking about tricky parts, right? And I imagine like there are some Drupal specific parts to the credit system that may need to be generalized. And I imagine that sort of thinking to be kind of difficult in some regards when trying to generalize it, right?
Yeah, because we're laying on another system. Like the credit system is an addition to the Git history. It's in addition to other aspects of how people contribute. So there's a lot of technical complexity there, but I mean, it's definitely a solvable problem, and but it's not necessarily an easy one. The part of the magic is to take this complex solution. And this is something else to consider, is the chaos community talks a lot about, starting with a goal and then coming up with like questions and then doing measurement. And if you are measuring something and you don't, and you wouldn't do anything differently if you knew the answer. Once you started measuring and you got your questions answered, then you would say, well, why did we even measure that? So it's important for a lot of folks just to start with saying, like, well, why do I want to know that information? What will I do? Or like, what questions do I have? And then would I change anything if I knew the answer to those questions?
Interesting.
Okay. So the next couple of questions are going to be a little hard hitting here, Matthew, because it's something that I've wondered about, and I'm sure many of our listeners probably have. So at this point in the show, everybody probably has a pretty good idea what the Drupal credit system is, and we've kind of talked about, the back end workings. But Drupal credits, right? Contributions are weighted. And I'm wondering if you can explain, the weighting part of the system and, more specifically, maybe like how that weighting structure works a little bit.
I know this is something that a lot of people are interested in because of the ramifications for understanding how things are weighted. So I can say that there are two. Well, you can get a basic overview of the system if you go to drupal.org/contribution-credit, and that will give you a brief overview. Now, there are a couple of aspects to the algorithm, as I understand it, and I guess I should also say that I don't know all of the inner workings of how this works. So there's the public aspect of the algorithm that gets discussed in Drupal core issues that has changed over the years, where there's been a lot of discussion about how we should weight things, what should be the most important. But then there's also the unknown aspect to this, the thing that makes it so people can't obviously game the system. So there are different weights for credits, and they've changed the weights in the past. And I can say as well that when they have changed the weights in the past, what happened was there is, okay, I have to back up a little bit. There's a page on Drupal.org, that's Drupal.org/marketplace. That's been around for a long time. I wrote about the history in one of my articles that was originally alphabetical. Then it was like just a couple of people. And that weighting essentially contributes to people's weight on the marketplace page. So that is where the weighting aspect comes in. So I think it's important to sort of mention that, because people that are that sell Drupal services want to be ranked highly on that page. And I have friends that worked really hard to get themselves weighted high. They did all the things right to get their organization moved up, and then the Drupal Association, or I'm not exactly sure if it was the association or a group of individuals, but the algorithm changed and then they got knocked off. And I knew people personally, and you can see this in the issue queue, people that felt just horrible, like, why I worked so hard and now I am no longer on the front page. I was before and now I'm not. So the Drupal community has taken this very seriously, and they a few years ago put together a committee to sort of recommend changes to the system. I did get access to some of their notes, but the committee actually didn't finish their work. But they looked at a bunch of different variables. They had a bunch of different spreadsheets where they were tweaking things here, there, and elsewhere. But I know that essentially they realized that you can really, significantly change the ranking system by just tweaking little things. So they basically just mapped out a bunch of different scenarios. What would happen if we changed this? What would happen if we changed that? And I know that there are also some changes coming. So I'm sort of scooting around the question, because within a few weeks, I think there's going to be more transparency for organizational profiles and owners, and how the contribution system works and how it will impact their marketplace position. I heard this from Tim Lanen at the Drupal Association. And so in essence, he wants to be able to say, or the association is moving towards being able to say, you have, X weighted credits from issues, which puts you like this percentage of the way to this partner level. And, ditto for other contribution activities. So if you
like some kind of progress.
Yeah, you can see like your financial contribution. So I haven't seen this new system. I sort of have patience for this topic for a while, and then I go back to wanting to do yoga and meditation things, and I jump back in and looking at data and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, so as I understand it though, this GitLab transition is helping inform what's going on with the contribution system. But there is more effort going on. There are issues linked to from the marketplace page that link to Drupal issues, where you can go and ask questions as well if you have specific questions. Right now, I'm just going to basically say it's an algorithm that is tweaked and has been changing, and that certain things have more relevance. Like a case study, I believe, has more impact if you spend a lot of time making a case study versus like attending a meeting. We like when I was helping organize Olivero, every person who attended the meeting could get a credit, and that's a very different kind of thing to attend a Slack meeting and maybe not even say that much, versus to create a whole case study. So things like that, they're pretty obviously different sorts of weights, and with both of those, neither of those are code contributions, incidentally.
So
yeah,
just to make sure I'm clear here,
Okay.
right? Or I'm understanding what you're saying. So it is true that as you just said, meetings versus core contributions versus module contributions versus the many other types of contributions that are out there, they're all weighted differently, right? Everybody gets one credit, but that credit has a different weight to it depending on what that contribution, what topic it falls into, basically.
Right. So on your Drupal.org profile, those are numbers, I believe. You have 8 credits or whatever for this module, this contrib module core, and that's I don't believe that there's any weighting that goes on there. The weighting is applicable to the marketplace page, which is for organizations.
Got it. So a credit is a credit. You have 25 credits. That's not accurate. You probably have way more, but you have 25 credits. This person has 50. Somebody else has 75. Those are your credits. You've done, you've been credited with fixing that many issues. But as far as marketplace goes and how like your company may be perceived or listed in the marketplace, that's where the weighting comes in.
Yes. And okay. If I have said anything, I apologize, and we could put something in the show notes. But I will just say that it is really complex. Like, I've looked at the algorithms, I've looked at the discussions. I know that there are other people that know more about this than I do. Like Neil Drum knows a lot more about how the technical aspects of it work. And I know there are parts of that are documented in the code and that parts of it are not, so that you can actually just go and look at how the code for the credit system works on Drupal.org if you want to know like really more details. But, ultimately what I'm interested more in is the human connections, how this affects people, encouraging people to our welcoming committee, our community, not to be too focused on all of like say you knew the answer to how does this, is this more than this? Is this more than that? Does that mean, well, I'm going to go out and write a bunch of case studies today? Well,
yes,
maybe that would be good. Maybe now that you've heard that, you might want to do that. But if there's something else you want to do, I feel like you should contribute in a way that feels like it's comfortable for you.
I will say here, Neil Drum, if you're listening, feel free to jump into the Talking Drupal channel and correct any inaccuracies that we may be propagating.
I think, I'm gonna, instead of asking you a question, I'm gonna answer a question, and then I want you to tell me how I'm wrong. So. If I were to try and answer the question, why are contributions weighted? I would say they are weighted in order to affect people's behavior. Ideally, like if we're being intentional about our weighting, then we're doing it in order to try and affect people's behavior. Why do you think we weight contributions?
I would say that is exactly why we weight contributions, is to influence people's behavior. But also, I would say it's also to try and be fair. That the truth is there have been times when we didn't have a weighting aspect to this. So people could write a bot, and they did, where they would like search through issues and find issues that needed re-rolling and create with automatic processes. You may have seen these in issues where people.
Yes, and I remember talking to some contributors and redirecting them to behaviors that were actually more beneficial, not right? But like, hey, do you want to help with Drupal? I see you doing a lot of things here. Like, could you help over here?
Yeah, because the thing is, the truth is, re-rolling patches is valuable, but if you're doing it just willy-nilly, like the Rector bot, I think is one of, with the Drupal. About that. Yeah, with the Drupal 8 compatibility push. I mean, that was probably one of the greatest contributions to the code base in an automated fashion that we've ever seen. But if you just have random bots just like creating hundreds of thousands of reroll patches that didn't really need to be rerolled, that's just a lot of white noise and becomes counterproductive in some level. So, but yeah, it's interesting.
I think another part of that, though, right, is that, again, a credit is a credit. Kathy has 100 credits. I have 200 credits, right? We all get a certain number of credits. The other aspect to weighting is really like a marketing, well, I don't want to say a marketing value, but like it's for companies to be able to say, hey, we're this involved in the community. Look, we're on this list. We're, this percentage involved in this community, right? And the weights allow them not to say, hey, we have 10,000 credits, right? But more so like we have, we're at this level because the credits are weighted in such a way that like decreases maybe like a non-code credit or weights it in such a way where like certain credits are not as powerful as a code credit or as a case study credit or so on and so forth. Is that kind of an accurate synopsis as well?
Yeah. I mean, it's complex stuff that some people are contributing patches. Some people are contributing to issue queues. Some people are writing documentation. Some people are writing automated tests. There's all kinds of ways that you can contribute, and I guess the way I like to put it is that we're trying to do our best to recognize the people that are working. And I think your earlier point is a really good one about like recognizing the organizations that contribute, and people like Dries and probably all of us want to see Drupal continue. And there's a lot of evidence that says if you are a community of people that are getting paid to work on a project, that the project will last longer. So we want to encourage organizations, and we want to say, hey, look, and we I know Dries loves to highlight organizations that make great contributions. And I work for an organization like Lullabot, where our marketing people love it if we do something and Dries mentions it in his keynote. That's great.
Yeah.
And that goes the same for every other organization. So
I was going to say, yeah, that's not just Lullabot. Dries says something about a company, everybody at that company in marketing's like, yeah, get the sound bite. Ship it.
And that's my point. It's not, I'm just saying, like, this is an example. I work, you all have, I think all of you are all paid to do Drupal, and we want our organizations to be recognized, especially when we know that they're making the community better. But I would say that a lot of the people that contribute to the community aren't doing so because they want to be recognized. It might just be that they get a lot of value from Drupal and they don't really need the recognition, or some of these companies that want to be able to, they get good marketing juice out of it. Whereas I've worked with plenty of organizations where they could care less if their organization had any credits or if they showed up anywhere on the marketplace page, because that's just not that important to their business model.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all at one point or another have worked for organizations that fit into that, right? They're like, Drupal works for us. It does a lot behind the scenes to power our websites, but like we'll pay for, X company, Y company to contribute to Drupal or build our site in Drupal, but we don't want really notoriety from it, right? That makes a lot of sense. And, I think, to an extent, weighting makes a lot of sense, right? To be able to get that list of companies that are really, really pushing Drupal forward. Moving into I don't know if these questions are as hard hitting, but they do have to do with weighting. And something near and dear to my heart, which is non-code contribution. As Nick said a little earlier on, we got Talking Drupal on Drupal.org as a kind of a non-code contribution a couple of years ago. 2 years ago, I don't know. And obviously people get credit for all sorts of things nowadays, podcasts, camps, going to meetings. I think you just mentioned, Matthew. So clearly non-code contributions are included in the credit system. Just out of curiosity, talking about weighting, do you know if they're weighted the same as code contributions?
I will just be honest and say I don't know the answer to that question. I know that they are included. I don't know how their weighting fits into the current system. I haven't dug into that level of detail.
That's fair. That's totally fair. Because I think it's kind of a question, and that's kind of what's in the box, right? As far as like what that weighting matrix is, right? And it sounds like maybe that the DA is working to kind of be more transparent about that weighting structure, which, I think it will be a welcome change to a lot of people. But I think that's definitely part of like the question here is like, everybody agrees the Drupal credit system is great. Everybody thinks that like, hey, contributing to open source is great and getting credit for it is great. But like understanding how those things are weighted and if they should, like, in my opinion, this is my opinion, I'm not speaking for anybody else, like a non-code contribution and a code contribution are equal, right? They're both a contribution to open source. Now, a case study contribution, I don't know. I don't know where the line gets drawn, right? Because essentially a case study is a non-code contribution, but it's also a marketing piece, right? What were you going to say, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough because it, like Matthew said earlier, it depends. Like it's one thing to contribute to an initiative by being the lead and organizing the meetings and calling people, following up with people. It's another thing to contribute to an initiative just by showing up to a Slack meeting and leaving one comment. And both are valuable. One is a little bit more essential. But it's not about our co-contributions more important than these types of contributions. It's like individually, it's about individually.
Yeah.
How do you automatically grant weight to
there's like a level of effort coefficient that needs to happen there. Like obviously if you're maintaining a you're the lead of an initiative, like there is a big chunk of work there that you need to do, right? As opposed to like, hey, I showed up to this meeting and I said some stuff.
And the same is true of co-contributions. There's some patches that require deep and long knowledge of Drupal core to patch, and then there's others where I just had an issue. Well, actually, no, it was actually a situation like I mentioned earlier, and that's why I thought of it. I created a patch for somebody, put it in, and then it was just fixing a typo on some page, so it wasn't even really important. And it took me 5 minutes to make the merge request. And they saw the patch and they were fixing something else, and they just, said, "Oh, I'll fix that typo while I'm creating this other patch," and they merged that other one in. Is my code contribution of fixing a typo equal to the contribution of writing a core patch that fixes a core bug that people have been running into for years? No.
I know.
But there's certainly value in both of those contributions, and they should both be recognized. But we're talking about weighting right now, not value.
Well, I think that's where. Okay, let me just. I'll just say this real quick. I think that's where weighting can be really powerful, is if something is somebody's first contribution.
That too. Oh, I didn't even think about that level.
So I don't think level of effort is the only factor involved, but I think this is about changing people's behaviors. And so if it's somebody's first contribution to Drupal, you want it to be really super easy for them to get a credit. If they're doing a 200th contribution to Drupal, do you really want that to be changing the level of their company in the marketplace. So anyway, I just want to toss this over to Matthew.
Wait. We need to have gamified badges for the Drupal credit system. Like, congratulations, you made your first non-code contribution. Congratulations, you made your.
See, I was gonna say a credit bonus. Like, hey, you get an extra 200 credits because it's your first, and like if it's your 200th, you get an extra 5 credits, right?
Yeah.
So I can go on and on and on, and I have gone on and on a little bit about some of these. One article I wrote called "Interpreting Drupal Core Commit History" is all. I just went back and looked at the whole history of Drupal core and see what I could figure out about the core maintainers who have committed, to see if there are any stories I could tell from those data. And as a result, it made me ask questions like, so is this commit worth more than another one? Is this patch, because it's super big, worth more than this one? Is this little thing that was super influential in Drupal's history less important than some other, so there's all kinds of fun ways to look at how important is a core commit.
Well,
and it's totally objective, right?
Completely objective.
Well,
so
no, some of it's subjective and some of it's subjective, I think.
I mean, I don't know. You like working on a really thorny patch, in my opinion, could be just as difficult as running a podcast for 8 years. I mean, they're just different. There's different levels of effort. There's different thinking that needs to happen, and like, I don't know.
What I would say is, I think the important thing about a lot of these weighted what's more important than others, I would say the important thing is that we're talking about it, that it's a discussion and not simply something that we have offloaded to a technical fix and that we're trying to find the perfect algorithm. We're saying this algorithm works for us, but it has flaws and we want to improve it, so let's talk about it. That to me is a sign of a community that is working well, that we can talk about these and say, well, is code more? Is that? Is running a meeting? Is running a camp? I mean, we account for a lot of that kind of stuff. If you are an initiative lead, you get weighted differently on how you're displayed in Drupal.org. Your organization does. If you have people that are, that run a camp, that kind of thing, that run a podcast, that all those things go, should go into the formula. And I would say we can definitely quibble about the particulars, but that for the most part, I think it's important that we're talking about it.
Well, I'm curious if somebody's interested in those analytics, can just anybody access these contribution credit weighting analytics, or is it something you have to go to the Drupal Association for? And have some sort of mandate? Like, how are you getting this data and helping analyze it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So originally, I just, would ask Tim for it. And he gave it to me because I was working on it with Dries, and Dries and I ultimately like chunked it up and said, all right, we're going to look at 12-month periods. And then therefore, the data shouldn't change. But there's all kinds of, I got really good using R in analyzing data, and I realized that things could even change later. But to answer your question, I think people can just ask for it. I think some of it is available through an API. I'm not totally sure on the current status of it, but I know that they're not trying to hide it.
No. Okay. So I can actually say I recently had a conversation with Tim about the API and potentially making API improvements because at EPAM we have an open source group, and we do have a kind of an internal credit system based on all of our open source contributions and efforts, and we wanted to pull in the Drupal data into that system. So we've been kind of working with the Drupal APIs to get more of that data into our own systems. So they are out there, and they are freely available for people to use.
Awesome. Yeah, I think there's I would love to have somebody who's better at statistics than me actually go in and look at our data and be able, because there's all kinds of interesting data sets that you can compare it to. That's what I've learned working with all of these data scientists and trying to figure out how they do things is, I'm trying to tease out interesting information about gender, about the makeup of the Drupal community, about who's getting say, who's getting their voice heard, who's contributing, and comparing it based on geographical information, comparing it to tweets. You can compare our data to all kinds of other interesting sources and tell interesting stories, but not a lot of people have actually done that. Most people are really just, for the most part, interested in where does my company show up on the marketplace page.
Yeah. So if we set aside that, the immediate marketplace benefit, and we think big picture, when I remember going to other open source conferences, I remember sharing what Drupal was doing with its credit system, and other open source communities looking at me wide-eyed and being like, oh, that's interesting, or wow, just like sparking a lot of things. And so, but that's been quite a few years. And so what I'm wondering now, it's okay if you don't know this, but I'm wondering now, what's the feedback loop look like on that? Is Drupal getting feedback from other communities about how to improve our credit system, or because we're trying to make this general purpose a possible reusable credit system? Are we getting any feedback from other communities?
Yes. And so part of the reason I got involved with the chaos community was so I could go in there and say, look, here's what we're doing. Is this useful or is this not useful? You're all experts. You're all community managers. You all come from different projects than me. And they all looked at this and said, wow, no, this is awesome. This is better than anything else. I don't know of anybody that's doing anything nearly as complex and cool. And if you're in the Drupal community and you're thinking like everybody else has cooler stuff, well, I don't think anybody else has cooler stuff when it comes to contribution credits.
But it's been like 10 years, right? Right? What was it you said?
6 years.
When did we do this?
2016 is when we really started using the system.
Okay, 6 years. All right, just feels like 10 years.
Funny, I would have thought you would have joined the chaos community just for the acronym, to say that you're part of the chaos community.
I have to say that has got to be a backronym and not an acronym, which is when they come up with the words just to they wanted chaos to be the acronym. Oh yeah, and came up with the words to match it. That's a backronym.
I mean, which is more of a talent in some regards, because depending on what your group does, that can be really hard.
I just wanted to say quickly before I forget, part of what I've done there is I opened up an issue to create a metric for contributing to an open source project that's based on what Drupal does, to just make the idea more general, and everybody's been on board. I don't think that's officially been committed though yet, but so there is in other words, there's a metric that says this thing that Drupal's doing, regardless of any of the technical implementation details, it's important, and we think it might be beneficial to any community, and therefore it would be a good addition to any sort of system that measures commits and measures contributions.
Yeah.
So Matthew, I think you were absolutely the right person to have on the show today to talk about this, because I think your point of view on it is great, and I think you're looking at it from a very wide perspective, which is definitely, I think, what we need. Before we close out the show, anything that we didn't mention that you wanna touch on? I know that there are new things regarding credit coming, and we'll wait for those with bated breath. But anything else?
I don't have a lot else to say about Drupal contribution credits. I think that anybody that is interested in this and wants to help push it forward, I know that getting this into GitLab, this is a high priority for the community. I already mentioned that, but other than that, I mean, I I don't have a lot to say about this particular topic other than, no, I'm going to say something. I
Go
just
for it.
came up with something, which was I just want to sort of drive home this point that if you're interested in this, I just would invite you to ask why you're interested. What are you interested in measuring, and just to sort of consider how you participate in the community. If you feel like you're being valued, if you feel like you're not being valued, and then talk about other people or try and figure out ways that we can, especially if you're not feeling valued, what are ways that we could recognize you? And I'll give a quick for instance. Like, I think one of the most important things that we do in the community has nothing to do with metrics, and it has a lot to do with recognizing people. So when people come to their first DrupalCon, there's this place where Dries brings somebody or a group of people up on stage, and they do like I'm going to commit this thing, and now you're part of the community, and it's your first commit, and it happens. And it, to me, just seems like this wonderful ritual where we're recognizing somebody, we're welcoming to our community, and any other ideas that you have like that, I would like to be part of and help support. And I just welcome any sort of contributions or ideas about contributing people in that way too. I think that's just really important to recognize.
Contribute to the contribution system. I think that's awesome. I'd like to thank you for joining us, and hopefully we can get you on again soon to talk about this in the future.
Thank you.
For our listeners, do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack and the Talking Drupal channel. And if you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and Chad's Book Corner, you can sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron.
Dr. Matthew Tift, if people wanted to get a hold of you to talk about the Drupal credit system or anything else, how could they do that?
The best way to stay in touch with me is to go to my website, matthewtift.com. You can sign up for my newsletter or my RSS feed. Then you hear from me regularly, and you can always write back or contact me. I'm also on all of the social medias, but I much prefer talking to people through websites like a Drupal website. So come.
There you go.
I use simple news. I don't use any spy pixels in my newsletter.
There you go. And people can get you on your podcasts, which is awesome.
Podcast, yes.
Kathy, how about you?
I'm on Twitter. I'm YesCT, as in yes. Kathy Thays. Also my Drupal.org username.
There you go. Nick Laughlin.
You can reach me pretty much everywhere at NixVan, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Have a good one, everyone.